This module covers some of the authorization and authentication methods available with Azure. Introduction. In this module, you'll be introduced to the Azure identity, access, and security services and tools. You'll learn about directory services in Azure, authentication methods, and access control. You'll also cover things like zero trust and defense in depth and how they keep your cloud safer. You'll wrap up with an introduction to Microsoft Defender for Cloud. Learning objectives. After completing this module, you'll be able to describe directory services in Azure, including Microsoft Entra ID and Microsoft Entra Domain Services. Describe authentication methods in Azure, including single sign-on, SSO, multi-factor authentication, MFA, and passwordless. Describe external identities and guest access in Azure. Describe Microsoft Entra Conditional Access. Describe Azure Role-Based Access Control, RBAC. Describe the concept of zero trust. Describe the purpose of the defense in-depth model. Describe the purpose of Microsoft Defender for Cloud. Describe Azure Directory Services. Microsoft Entra ID is a directory service that enables you to sign in and access both Microsoft Cloud applications and cloud applications that you develop. Microsoft Entra ID can also help you maintain your on-premises Active Directory deployment. For on-premises environments, Active Directory running on Windows Server provides an identity and access management service that's managed by your organization. Microsoft Entra ID is Microsoft's cloud-based identity and access management service. With Microsoft Entra ID, you control the identity accounts, but Microsoft ensures that the service is available globally. If you've worked with Active Directory, Microsoft Entra ID will be familiar to you. When you secure identities on premises with Active Directory, Microsoft doesn't monitor sign-in attempts. When you connect Active Directory with Microsoft Entra ID, Microsoft can help protect you by detecting suspicious sign-in attempts at no extra cost. For example, Microsoft Entra ID can detect sign-in attempts from unexpected locations or unknown devices. Who uses Microsoft Entra ID? Microsoft Entra ID is for IT administrators. Administrators can use Microsoft Entra ID to control access to applications and resources based on their business requirements. App developers. Developers can use Microsoft Entra ID to provide a standards-based approach for adding functionality to applications that they build, such as adding SSO functionality to an app or enabling an app to work with a user's existing credentials. Users. Users can manage their identities and take maintenance actions like self-service password reset. Online service subscribers, Microsoft 365, Microsoft Office 365, Azure, and Microsoft Dynamics CRM online subscribers are already using Microsoft Entra ID to authenticate into their account. What does Microsoft Entra ID do? Microsoft Entra ID provides services such as authentication. This includes verifying identity to access applications and resources. It also includes providing functionality such as self-service password reset, multi-factor authentication, a custom list of banned passwords, and smart lockout services. Single sign-on. Single sign-on, SSO, enables you to remember only one username and one password to access multiple applications. A single identity is tied to a user, which simplifies the security model. As users change roles or leave an organization, access modifications are tied to that identity, which greatly reduces the effort needed to change or disable accounts. Application management. You can manage your cloud and on-premises apps by using Microsoft Entra ID. Features like application proxy, SaaS apps, the My Apps portal, and single sign-on provide a better user experience. Device management. Along with accounts for individual people, Microsoft Entra ID supports the registration of devices. Registration enables devices to be managed through tools like Microsoft Intune. It also allows for device-based conditional access policies to restrict access attempts to only those coming from known devices, regardless of the requesting user account. Can I connect my on-premises AD with Microsoft Entra ID? If you had an on-premises environment running Active Directory, and a cloud deployment using Microsoft Entra ID, you would need to maintain two identity sets. However, you can connect Active Directory with Microsoft Entra ID, enabling a consistent identity experience between cloud and on-premises. One method of connecting Microsoft Entra ID with your on-premises AD is using Microsoft Entra Connect. Microsoft Entra Connect synchronizes user identities between on-premises, Active Directory, and Microsoft Entra ID. Microsoft Entra Connect synchronizes changes between both identity systems, so you can use features like SSO, multi-factor authentication, and self-service password reset under both systems. What is Microsoft Entra Domain Services? Microsoft Entra Domain Services is a service that provides managed domain services such as domain join, group policy, lightweight directory access protocol, LDAP, and Kerberos NTLM authentication. Just like Microsoft Entra ID lets you use directory services without having to maintain the infrastructure supporting it, with Microsoft Entra Domain Services, you get the benefit of domain services without the need to deploy, manage, and patch domain controllers, DCs, in the cloud. A Microsoft Entra Domain Services managed domain lets you run legacy applications in the cloud that can't use modern authentication methods, or where you don't want directory lookups to always go back to an on-premises ADDS environment. You can lift and shift those legacy applications from your on-premises environment into a managed domain without needing to manage the ADDS environment in the cloud. Microsoft Entra Domain Services integrates with your existing Microsoft Entra tenant. This integration lets users sign into services and applications connected to the managed domain using their existing credentials. You can also use existing groups and user accounts to secure access to resources. These features provide a smoother lift and shift of on-premises resources to Azure. How does Microsoft Entra Domain Services work? When you create a Microsoft Entra Domain Services managed domain, you define a unique namespace. This namespace is the domain name. Two Windows Server domain controllers are then deployed into your selected Azure region. This deployment of DCs is known as a replica set. You don't need to manage, configure, or update these DCs. The Azure platform handles the DCs as part of the managed domain, including backups and encryption at rest using Azure Disk Encryption. Is information synchronized? A managed domain is configured to perform a one-way synchronization from Microsoft Entra ID to Microsoft Entra Domain Services. You can create resources directly in the managed domain, but they aren't synchronized back to Microsoft Entra ID. In a hybrid environment with an on-premises ADDS environment, Microsoft Entra Connect synchronizes identity information with Microsoft Entra ID, which is then synchronized to the managed domain. Applications, services, and VMs in Azure that connect to the managed domain can then use common Microsoft Entra Domain Services features such as domain join, group policy, LDAP, and Kerberos NTLM authentication.